called Wagner and the Kaiserreich.
Thank you. I have to warn you, I wrote this myself. So what I mean by that is, if you find sort of Germanic idioms, etc., it's all my fault, and I assume entire responsibility. Now, in this presentation, I would like to answer the question why the Kaiserreich was so disinterested in Bayreuth, when in fact Bayreuth was the most important cultural outpost in the newly founded empire of 1871. I will use mainly the term Reich or Kaiserreich, because that, as far as I can see, is part of the English-speaking historiography. I mean, when you write and talk about it instead of the empire. So it must be surprising that this exact question has never provoked historical interest, actually. Why exactly did the Reich not respond to Wagner's wooing, and why has it never, during the existence of the Bayreuth Festival, at least until the First World War, tackle the issue of Bayreuth again as one of national importance? And when discussing this, I would like to look at first at two questions to introduce that. What did Wagner expect from the Reich in 1871? And what actually do we mean by the Reich when we talk about that? The question why the Reich was not interested in Bayreuth has not received sufficient attention in the literature, I think, whereas both those first two questions, Wagner's expectations of the Reich and the Reich's refusal to respond, are fairly well researched and documented. To find out about that, I had to go into the three main archives that keep records about this question. First, the Bundesarchiv, so the German National Archives, Geheimes Preußisches Staatsarchiv, keeping records of the disappeared Prussian state, and the Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amts, meaning the archives of the German Foreign Office. Now, come to the first questions. Great expectations. Well before 1871, at a time when Wagner was still resident at the court of Ludwig II of Bavaria, Wagner had become a Bismarckian. In 1866, during the Austro-Prussian War, Wagner switched from an anti-Prussian stance to the conviction that a united Germany had to contain Bavaria in its boundaries, which only could be achieved by and with Bismarck. This, by the way, is the beret moment John Dethridge was talking about this morning. It coincides, and not by accident. I think he's not here anymore, is he? Because I wonder whether the beret disappeared when Wagner sort of went away from the Reich again. Anyway, so when the German states fought against France as from July 1870, Wagner composed a poem to the German army in front of Paris, January 71, and a musical piece in honor of the newly elected emperor, the Kaisermarsch. Wagner traveled into the Reich for the first time and to the new Reich's capital of Berlin at the end of April and the beginning of May 1871. He was received by Bismarck on May the 3rd, 1871, and this was the only personal encounter of the two German giants of the 19th century. Wagner was received in a sort of family circle, and very quickly the conversation was, to Wagner's great disappointment, directed towards matters of social and parliamentary gossip. Even though Wagner claimed, according to Cosima's diaries, not to have sought the Chancellor's financial backing for the project of a national theater to stage The Ring, he most certainly hoped for it. 2 days later, still in Berlin, Wagner gave a gala concert at the Berlin Court Opera House, introducing his Kaisermarsch in the presence of the Emperor William I and the whole court. And this encounter, sort of the encounter of the new emperor with his music, did not have reverberations on Wagner's projects either. Wagner's hopes at this time are most clearly articulated in a letter, of all people, to Ludwig II on the 1st of March 1871, quote, "My aim is to call into existence a national German undertaking, the direction of which may be placed entirely in my own hands alone." In fact, between 1871 and 76, Wagner turned towards the Reich 4 times. First, September 1871, he used a friend, a personal acquaintance of his, an old 48er, Lothar Bucher, who worked for Bismarck as from 1864, to send him the essay Deutsche Kunst und Deutsche Politik, German Art and German Policy, as translated by Ellis. I don't know whether that's a good translation. And that was without a response by Bismarck. It was just the sending of this essay. Second, in June 1873, Wagner sent a letter to Bismarck personally, sending his freshly printed essay, Das Bühnenfestspielhaus zu Bayreuth, and Wagner urged Bismarck in his letter not to act like Frederick II, who had remained, quote, strange and cold towards the rebirth of the German spirit, end quote, meaning the authors, the German literature of the second half of the 18th century. Again, as in May 1871, no response from the Chancellor. Third moment, when the whole enterprise was at the brink of failure, end of 73, beginning of 74, Wagner wanted the Grand Duke of Baden to intervene in Berlin to obtain national support by conceiving the Festspiele as a national Lustralfeier, it's an old Roman holiday of Roman times, and he wanted to organize that to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Frankfurt Peace of 1871, sort of creating a political surrounding. The Grand Duke refused this, claiming that the political situation was not favorable at this moment. It is said that the German Reich authorities said, we can't do this because that is something like the Bavarian sovereign territory, culturally speaking, and that this was sort of mentioned to Ludwig as well. Final attempt, Wagner wrote again to Bismarck personally, December 28, 1875, this time explicitly to seek support from Berlin, to which Bismarck replied very briefly, asking Wagner that he, quote, refrain from sending letters to the busy Chancellor, end quote, and better turn directly to the Reichstag, which Wagner dismissed as dishonorable. So this last attempt finally buried Wagner's hopes. Wagner certainly expected a lot, if not all, from the new Reich in 1871. He carefully navigated between Munich and Berlin, leaving Ludwig II's benevolence behind in 1871 in order to turn all his hopes towards the Reich, but yet again accepting the Bavarian king's help in January 1874, while not hesitating to call upon Berlin once again in 1875-76. I would like to look now at the internal structure of the Reich. To understand the functioning of the new empire after 1871, we have to take a closer look at its administrative structure. The first 5 to 10 years at least, it was in a transitional period with many competences not divided clearly between Prussia and the empire, and on the other hand between the political administration and the imperial family. More importantly, the structure of the Reich was in its early years entirely centered around the Reich Chancellery. Only throughout the 1870s, independent Ämter, offices or departments were created. And those Ämter were headed by Staatssekretäre, who gradually were more and more responsible for their departments, but they were not authorized to sign in ultimate resort until 1918. So that had to be done by the Chancellor, which gives the Chancellor this strong position within the administration of the Reich. The Reichstag, German parliament, played a minor role compared to the executive bodies of the German Empire. However, it was, together with the Bundesrat, the representation of Germany's 25 federal states, responsible for legislation and increasingly budgetary questions. Its limited influence on executive decisions stood behind Bismarck's recommendation to Wagner of January 1876 to address the Reichstag for financial help. Nevertheless, the Reichstag debated an important matter of interest to Bayreuth concerning the alteration of a copyright law, which was within the parliament's competences, so-called Parsifal protection, between 1901 and 1913. Apart from this level of institutional bodies, the term Reich also consisted of the imperial family of the Hohenzollern. Even though correspondence and documents of members of the family often concerned public or political matters, they were considered to be private documents, and therefore they are kept in the Geheimes Preußisches Staatsarchiv as private affairs of the members of the Hohenzollern family. The factual political importance of the emperor or the members of the royal family, however, always depended on its weight vis-à-vis the Chancellor. Under William I, Bismarck held the reins of central decisions in his hands, whereas William II strengthened the position of the emperor as of 1890, facing weaker chancellors after Bismarck's sacking in 1890. Due to the personalized structure of the Reich until its very end, only the Chancellor and the Emperor were able to make central decisions concerning the Reich in general or the question of a national theater in particular. The minor bodies, such as the Ämter, the Reichstag, were reduced to advisory functions, to the effect that factually all was dependent on the authority of Bismarck and the Emperor. Now, finally, to answer the central question I asked at the beginning, why the Reich remained so consistently silent about national support for the Bayreuth Festival, I would like to have a closer look at the different positions taken by the main representatives of the Kaiserreich. First, Bismarck. After 1866, Bismarck considered Wagner to be an important ally with influence on Ludwig II, since Wagner was in favor of the idea of integrating Bavaria into a united Germany without Austria. After 1870-71, this changed, which has two possible explanations. On the one hand, Bismarck was not interested in music at all. If he had been fascinated by music, or Wagner's music in particular, as was Ludwig II, things might have been rather different. On the other hand, Bismarck was a power politician and the champion of checks and balances within Europe, but also within his most important creation, the German Empire. He considered Bayreuth to be the competence and concern of Bavaria and Ludwig II, and therefore did everything in order not to offend the king. Thus, to Bismarck's conviction, Bayreuth was never to fall under imperial protection or to benefit from its financial support. In his contacts with Wagner in the 1870s, Bismarck had always kept a distance and remained very unspecific. However, there's a document, a submission in German, Immediatschreiben, of September the 20th, 1888, in which Bismarck recommends William II not to accept the official patronage of the Bayreuth Festival. For once he stressed very clearly that, I quote, "A patronage held by your Majesty in Bayreuth would harm the internal political situation of the German Reich in no small degree," end quote. Bismarck was afraid that the Reich's interior coherence would fall apart and convinced that everything had to be done to keep Bavaria in a pro-Russian mood and to give to the anti-Prussian ultramontane opposition no reason to cause unrest. William I, first emperor, acted rather as a friendly old monarch who fulfilled his duties of representation and showed himself well disposed towards Wagner and his achievements. However, he never made an effort to make Bayreuth a national affair. He encountered Wagner and his music at several occasions: Meistersinger in Berlin 1870, the Kaisermarsch concert 71, Tristan in Berlin 76. He was at Rheingold Walküre at the first festival in 76 in Bayreuth, and finally a Walküre in Berlin 1881. But he was there exclusively as a head of state, not as a personal admirer of Wagner's music. He reportedly recommended to the Reichskanzleramt to consider Wagner's wish for national support in 1876, but he did nothing to press on Bismarck in this matter after the latter had recommended that this request be made to the Reichstag. The interim emperor, Frederick III, had no important political power, but in his diaries, which were published last year, you can see that he had no understanding of Wagner's music. One interesting episode, nevertheless, is shedding light on the central question of today. He was visiting Bayreuth in September 1873 as the Crown Prince, and he visited the palaces and churches containing the tombs of his ancestors. 18th century until the early 19th century was a Hohenzollern area, Bayreuth. But after he had visited all these places, he openly said that he refused to visit the Festspielhaus, which has just been finished as a building, because he had to be considerate of the jealousy of the king and could not view more things, King Ludwig II. Finally, among the emperors, William II, who visited the Bayreuth Festival in the summer of 1886 with his friend Philipp zu Eulenburg, and just after his accession to the throne, he raised the hopes of Cosima Wagner to agree to an imperial patronage for Bayreuth, and Bismarck successfully dismissed this through this submission of September the 20th and by a personal conversation with the Kaiser on October the 31st. And after that, the question of patronage was never raised again. In fact, it was Prince Regent Luitpold who accepted it in January 1889. And in the long reign of William II, Wagner and Bayreuth played no part at all. As far as understanding of music is concerned, Cosima Wagner, who was seated next to him during a dinner, said afterwards, "To make him understand only the basics of music, I would need 3 years on a lonely island." So there was nothing to expect from him. Looking at Bismarck's often nameless successors, only 2 out of 8 were likely to be concerned about Bayreuth, but in both cases without effect. First, the Prince of Hohenlohe-Schillingsfürst, Chancellor between 1894 and 1900, had been appointed Prime Minister of Bavaria in 1866 through a recommendation of Wagner to King Ludwig II. Hence, Hohenlohe knew Wagner personally, even owed him his first important political position. He did not even mention this in his memoirs, presumably in order to conceal this embarrassing fact, being helped by a composer, and other than that, was not concerned with Wagner or Bayreuth during his mandate at all. Second, his successor, Prince Bernhard von Bülow, 1900 to 1909, was a personal acquaintance of Cosima Wagner and once confessed that his wife brought him eventually to understand and appreciate Wagner's music, but did not, as his predecessor, show any interest in Bayreuth as a cultural institution. I would briefly mention a source which I found in the Bundesarchiv, which is called State Subsidies for Purposes of Science and Public Interest, meaning there was support for scientific and cultural enterprises. And for example, there was money given to the archaeological institutes in Rome and Athens, 4.7 million Reichsmarks, to the Germanic Museum in Nuremberg, 2.8 million Reichsmarks, etc., etc. So it was a lot of money, but interestingly, not a single pfennig was given for the Bayreuth Festival, as opposed to today, as you know, with the German federal government backing Bayreuth since the 1950s. Last but not least, the Reichstag. The only time the Reichstag was concerned with issues of the Bayreuth Festival was in connection with a petition of the Wagner family demanding to prolong the Parsifal protection beyond the usual 30 years copyright delay after the author's death. In 1901, the Reichstag refused to grant this exception, and further legal attempts to change this in 1910 and 12 did not alter this decision either. Even this was an exclusively legal issue, a Reich institution again was speaking out against Bayreuth and the Wagner Theatre, and contemporary sources suggest that hostility towards the Wagner family was governing the decision of many members of the Reichstag. As I hope to have demonstrated, the 47 years of history of the Kaiserreich are marked by a very personalized political system. As we have seen, the main decision makers of the Reich, the chancellors, in fact, only Bismarck, and the 2 emperors did not show interest in making the Bayreuth Festival a national symbol. Considering the importance of the Bayreuth Festival as a central cultural outpost in the Kaiserreich, it is surprising how silent the sources in the political and cultural political archives appear on the whole. There are only very few documents that show any reaction or position that the Reich took vis-à-vis the Bayreuth Wagner Festival. And if one wants to find out the exact reason why the Reich did not respond to Wagner's and Bayreuth's wishes, one always gets back to Bismarck's diplomatic but firm resistance of the 1870s. In all direct and indirect encounters with Wagner, the Iron Chancellor managed to avoid discussions about the subject, the personal encounter in 1871, to silence the demands by not responding, the 2 letters or sendings of 1871 and 73, or to force the issue into futile channels, like the recommendation to turn to the Reichstag in 1876. Bismarck's submission, the Immediatschreiben of 1888, addressed to William II, where for once he clearly articulated his reservations, has been known and mentioned by a few Wagner scholars, but it has never, in my view, has been never perceived and acknowledged in its full scale. This document reflects Bismarck's deep conviction about the issue and shows the reasons why Berlin remained silent towards Bayreuth, not only in the 1870s, but throughout the whole period of the Kaiserreich. Bismarck was the central driving force behind the Reich's entire foreign and domestic relations between 1871 and 1890. All major issues were governed and controlled by Bismarck. Wagner became, just as in Paris during the 1861 Tannhäuser scandal, a pawn of political conflicts that had nothing to do with art. Wagner himself was responsible for this, since he placed himself between Munich and Berlin, not only symbolically with the geographical location of Bayreuth, but he accepted voluntarily King Ludwig II's support from 1864 onwards, and again in 1874, but wanted at the same time the full recognition of the empire after its foundation in 1871. Since, in Bismarck's view, the most important and vital ally within Germany to secure the Reich's unity was Bavaria, he did everything not to rebuff Ludwig II and his successor, the Prince Regent Luitpold. Bayreuth was, in Bismarck's conviction, cultural and political sovereign territory of Bavaria. This is the exact reason for Bismarck's and the Reich's reluctance to support Wagner in the 1870s. It also governed the Crown Prince Frederick III when he refused in 1873 to visit the Festival Theatre with reference to the jealousy of the king, and it stood behind the silent reluctance to listen to Wagner's call upon the Reich through the Grand Duke of Baden in 1874. And it was still valid in 1888, when William II was supposed to become patron of the Bayreuth Festival. Supporting Bayreuth financially, making the Festspielhaus a national theatre, simply did not fit into Bismarck's understanding of the internal balance of the Reich. Bismarck's decision remained an iron legacy until 1914, since never again the Bayreuth question was raised to the national agenda. Hence, Bismarck's rule that shaped the Reich in the 1870s and 80s also determined the Reich's stance towards Bayreuth, with an impact lasting until the First World War, in fact until 1933, when a new Reich finally did agree to take Bayreuth under its wings, with fatal consequences for the institution of Bayreuth and for the public Wagner image up to this very day. But that is a different story to tell. I thank you for your attention.
Okay, any questions for Hermann Grampp?
Thank you very much. Just two small footnotes concerning Friedrich III. Somewhere in Cosima Wagner's diaries, there's an entry bearing on the dashed hopes of the Wagners for a subsidy from that quarter, and Cosima writes something like that a problem, among others, was with his partner, his wife, who's supposed to have said, "Ach, nein, Fritz, no, let's not do this, Fritz." And that was the end of that. The other footnote is concerning the end point of this around 1913, when there were a whole bunch of efforts, a virtual campaign to try to extend somehow that control of Bayreuth over Parsifal. And in his recent book on Hitler's private library, Timothy Rybak noticed that one of the books from this period concerning Parsifal, probably given to Hitler, one suspects around 23, 24, when he first showed up in Bayreuth, was exactly in this nature, reminding us that the issue continued on from the Second Reich to the Third Reich, because the Wagner family harbored hopes that Hitler, once in power, would restore their control over Parsifal, from which they had handsomely benefited.
May I just say, thank you very much. I didn't know that. It's very interesting.
Oh, no, you've got.
Oh, yeah. But the first question about Frederick III is interesting. Well, there are many more quotations to that effect in his diary. I didn't have the impression that it was his wife. He personally didn't like the music, and you have about 10 or 12 quotes of that kind. And he personally disliked Wagner because he wanted to receive him during the Ring in Berlin in 1881, and Wagner sort of refused that, claiming having a cold. And from that moment on, Wagner was, you know, unbearable to Friedrich.
Oh, no, here, and then, yeah, and then Hans, okay. Oh, okay, we have 4. You're 2.
Thank you for that talk, Bobby. I just had a question in relation to your other research on French Wagnerism. I was thinking while your talk, it seemed to me that if we think about the relationship of what's happening in Germany and what's happening in France at the same time, that the one possible explanation for the extreme popularity of Wagner in France and the sort of vogue of Wagnerism in France is that it's a way of claiming or appropriating Wagner, like the Beret, appropriating Wagner for French nationalism. Do you think that in some ways we can understand French Wagnerism dialectically in relationship to the silence of the Kaiserreich in relation to Wagner?
Should I answer that directly? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Not in terms of French nationalism, but in terms of cultural avant-garde. So I don't have the impression that the French Wagnerism was something which, well, it wasn't, because as from 1871, interestingly, Wagner could not be staged in French opera houses until 1891 for political reasons, being something like the national composer of the arch enemy. But the French considered Wagner to be a very international avant-garde artist, the international avant-garde artist per se, and in a way they Francisized him to that effect. And actually, I don't know whether the silence of the Reich was perceived in France, but it's an interesting question. But I wouldn't say in terms of French nationalism, but Wagner as the epitome of the avant-garde as such.
I'm down here in the front.
Thank you very much for this very interesting paper. I was just wondering, looking at the situation mid-19th century, 1870, why would like Prussia or like then the German Reich would be interested in taking over Bayreuth or Wagner? Because I think also looking at what Wagner did, actually, his work is not ideal to be, you know, serving for national identity construction, I would think. I mean, we of course know about the history afterwards, which what happened, but I think look at the Ring and like Parsifal, that's not like works where like one country would like want to identify with. Of course, Meistersinger is a different story. How would you answer that?
I would answer it's a different story, it's true. Now, I think Anthony could say more about this because that was part of his paper. But, well, what I tried to do is, there were projections of Wagner, of himself, and he expected something, and did the Reich respond to that? That is indeed a different question, and, well, I mean, I would say, if ever the Prussian state or the German Reich would be interested then in something like a national symbolic theater, independent of the contents, which might be disturbing indeed to somebody from, say, the court in Berlin, yes.
Do you want to say anything like that? Okay. Down front here. Okay.
I was just going to say that Friedrich III's wife was England.
She was, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, they were both very liberal, but that's, I think, a different question. And opposed to Bismarck and to the establishment.
Well, but if she didn't like the music, I mean, it might have been because she was raised in England.
Well, all I found was that he didn't like the music. No, but you know.
It's interesting. Over there, Hans Vazsonyi.
Thank you. Let me preface my question by referring you to an interesting genre of historical writing, novels that are based on the question of what if. For instance, what would have happened to the United States if Charles Lindbergh had become president? In the spirit of this kind of writing and, frankly, speculation, I would like to ask you what your thoughts are about the possibility of the Reich and the Hohenzollern assuming the patronage of Bayreuth. I'm asking this because we have to remember that National Socialism did not originate in Prussia or in Berlin. It originated in Austria and in Bavaria. And Bismarck's decision to not to interfere with the cultural sovereignty of Bavaria may have had consequences along those lines that I've suggested. So my question is, do you have any thoughts on this, and would you care to speculate?
Well, the question arose while I was preparing the paper, and I even, it's not that I found a solution or an answer, but one thing I think one can conceive is that it wouldn't have changed a thing when you talk about the Third Reich. I mean, what I thought about was if ever it had happened, be it in 1876 or 88 or 89, that it became a national institution or a Prussian cultural institute, it wouldn't have changed anything. Even if it had been continued to be like that in the Weimar Republic, it wouldn't have changed anything about 1933. So that was the only thought I spent about that.
That's obvious. But the big question is, during the long incubation period of National Socialism, that period coincides with the most intensive period in Wagner's afterlife in Germany. Would it have had an effect during those 50 years, not after 33? That's pointless. By that time, most of the decisions regarding the Wagner legacy were already taken.
Yes, please, go on.
Well, if I can intervene, I actually do have an idea.
Excellent.
Couple of things. I mean, indirectly, to come back to the previous question, I think that the contributions of the Reich to Bayreuth were much more important, first of all, to Wagner than they were to the Empire. It remains an open question. I mean, because there's, as I referred to during my talk, there's all sorts of various projects of trying to create a sense of nation after the empire is created, with the Sedantag as being a national festival, the emperor's birthday being a festival. And it's interesting that theater and music and that didn't really come up on the radar screen. So I think one way of going back to your earlier question might be, well, would this have been an appropriate place for imperial patronage? The answer was already decided in Berlin. No, it wasn't appropriate, notwithstanding the political issues. And as I've mentioned elsewhere, I mean, the rivalry between Prussia and for Bavaria, I mean, it wasn't just, well, we don't want to piss off Ludwig in Bavaria, but there's also the symbolic issue of that's already Ludwig's patronage, and so it doesn't make any sense for us to go where some other prince is already established. But to go back to this question, what would have happened if the empire did emerge as the patron? Well, one thing I think that would have happened is that the cult of Bayreuth that develops especially after Wagner's death, that would not have come into existence, because that would not have been keeping with the nature of a public institution. And inasmuch as the dimensions of that cult, and perhaps even the exclusivity with which only Wagner's works were performed at Bayreuth, I think that after his death, had the intendant of the Royal Opera come over and succeeded Wagner rather than Cosima, I think that a very different culture would have evolved, and we might have ended up with something that would have been a German National Opera House, a German National Theater, but it wouldn't have had the same cultic Germanic overtones that very quickly took root in Bayreuth after Wagner's death.
Might I add here that in contrast to Vienna and Munich, Berlin was, relatively speaking, less anti-Semitic. And the effect of the cult of Bayreuth that you referred to was, to a large extent based on anti-Semitism. And one might well speculate, at least that's what I'm doing right now, that had Berlin taken Bayreuth under its wings, things might have turned out differently. I don't know how, but...
Nick, can we take one more question? Okay, up there.
Yeah, Kaiser did come to Bayreuth in 1889. He had also attended as Crown Prince, I believe, in 86. Did the 89 visit have some connection with the 88 communication that you described? Was it perhaps some sort of conciliatory gesture, or do you know of any other connection between the two events?
No reverberations as far as I could find out. He was supposed to come in 1888 as well, with his friend Eulenburg, who introduced him to Wagner and Bayreuth. And just because he became emperor 2 months before, he didn't come to Bayreuth in 1888. So as far as I know, I think that's the postponed visit. And I found no trace, for example, by Cosima Wagner being disappointed or conversation with the emperor about this question.
But if I might just add just a really quick footnote, because I know we're supposed to wrap up too. Bayreuth stopped asking. I mean, we shouldn't I mean, in this question about the relationships, after Wagner is basically passed off to the Reichstag, Bayreuth doesn't ask again. Even the famous copyright issue in 1901, that only comes up actually as a footnote to the German decision to join the Berne Convention, in which it had been debated, well, what is the length of time that artistic work should be recovered? And Cosima, it had come out that Cosima had some interest, and so there was a formal request to the Reichstag, but that's been made actually after the German convention, or the German changes to the law have already been approved by the Reichstag. So it comes after the fact, and the big battle over Parsifal and changing the copyright law to protect Parsifal is not launched by White, but rather by the Bayreuth Circle.
Good. Well, I think we will wrap up now. I just wanted to thank the panelists for these richly textured, conceptual ways of describing for us the space between Wagner himself and nation building and nationalism. I mean, it's not that we don't find them irrelevant, but they are obviously not, you know, completely tied to each other. In Catherine's sense that came through in hers of Wagner's unwillingness to be involved with so overt a nationalist figure as Theodor Körner, in Tony's description and analysis of Wagner's, I think you used the word cross purposes, detachment. It's a kind of skewed relationship to German nationalism of official or popular sorts, which illustrates his unwillingness to be tied to any particular program. Not like Hitler's unwillingness to be tied to his program, but it reminds one of the importance of his own vision of the Sein und Werden distinction you made. And in your case, Hermann, the official nationalism or official nation building, to put it more precisely, distance to Wagner himself and to the Wagnerian project. I think all of these have very productively taken us beyond just distinguishing between Wagner and Wagnerism. And I thank you all for that.